One thing I've always kind of resented about Warhammer is that it will present such cool ideas, factions, and characters, and then just not do anything with them.
Out of the way, you!
Hi, I'm Chrono the Harlequin, and welcome back to Live from the Black Library, where today I want to talk to you about the Officio Assassinorum, one of my favorite factions in all of Warhammer, and one of the most woefully underutilized, right next to the Harlequins, my other favorite faction. Yay! But before I get into it, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, consider joining my Discord server linked down below, or even subscribing to my Patreon if you want to help me make these videos even faster, and fund my new history channel also linked below, because those videos are going to be fully illustrated and thusly very expensive. But without further ado, let's get into the Officio Assassinorum. Now, when most people think of the Officio Assassinorum, they're usually thinking of the assassins themselves, the different temple types and the different variants. But what's really interesting to me is the history of the office itself, because it is one of the oldest institutions in the Imperium of Man, militarily speaking, predating by a wide margin the Sisters of Battle, the Inquisition, the Imperial Guard and Imperial Navy, hell, even the Space Marines. In fact, the only two groups who are older than the Officio Assassinorum, even though it wasn't always under that name, are the Adeptus Custodes and the Legio Contagious, that being the Thunder Warriors. You see, they first actually began their existence under the control of the Ephoroi, that being a branch of the Custodes which dealt with silent assassinations and subterfuge and intelligence gathering. These would just be Imperial assassins in general. However, as the Great Crusade began to spread out, we get a bit of a conflicting source, because it's generally believed or stated that the Imperial assassins would actually go out on their own initiative with the Great Crusade without the Emperor's knowing and make sure that his will was enacted, killing anyone who might breathe rebellion within the ranks of the Imperial army, dealing with problematic governors, and making sure that the Emperor's promises to the human race were kept by eliminating anyone in the Emperor's service who might not live up to those ideals. However, they would eventually reveal their existence to the Emperor, and he, allegedly sorrowfully, accepted the fact that what they do is necessary for the Imperium he was trying to build. And so, he was so grateful to them and pleased with their work that he had temples built so that they could better hone their skills and train new applicants into the orders that were being created, which were at the time known as clades. And each of these clades after the founding head of each clade, and those would be Sire Callidus, Sire Culexus, Sire Venenum, Sire Eversor, Sire Vanus, and Sire Vindicare. And a side note here before I really start diving in, I don't know why I do this, but I can never pronounce it Vindicare like other people do. Like, I pronounce them all normally except that one I pronounced weirdly Italian for some reason. It's like Callidus, the Shapeshifter, Culexus, the Terrible Null, Eversor, the Raging Maniac, and Vindicare, lui spara con la pistola. You know, I don't know why, but I just can't help it. But getting back on track, here you can already start to see a discrepancy in regard to the origin of the temples, because firstly, it's stated that the Imperial assassins were initially a thing during the Unification Wars as an answerable human branch under the control of a group of the Adeptus Custodes, but then it says that, oh, they were people acting on their own initiative during the Great Crusade era? That wouldn't happen. No way the Imperium would just not know about these people killing people left, right, and center under their noses, quote-unquote, on their behalf. Those people would need to use the Imperium's infrastructure to move around planets, and there would have to be a massive amount of communication and coordination. There's no way they could do these things in any meaningful capacity without being insane lone wolves if they didn't have access to Imperial intelligence. And if you were doing things for the Emperor, firstly, he wouldn't be so forgiving. Oh, you were just going around killing people without my approval? Yeah, that's fine. In fact, I'm proud of you. You're doing a good job. No, he would be furious that you were doing this without his knowledge and possibly jeopardizing his very delicate vision. And two, if you were doing this without the Emperor's knowledge, no you weren't, because he absolutely would have known. He was not the don't know about things kinda guy. It was very rare that things happened without his knowledge, and the one time they did, things got really, really bad. You see, I believe this is essentially a piece of internal mythology for the Officio Assassinorum, an origin story they tell themselves and give their members over the generations as millennia have passed, so that they can feel like they're particularly special, not just another branch of the organization, but one with a direct spiritual connection to the Emperor because he personally signed off on their actions after they pleased him. And part of the reason I believe this to be the case is because how the Officio Assassinorum was formed was the leaders of all 6 clades got together and swore a binding pact to seek no glory and continue their work from the shadows. In fact, all of the 6 Directors Primus didn't even know each other's identities or faces, so you might ask then, how were they working together? Well, that's because there was a 7th member, the head Director Primus, known as the Grand Master. And this Grand Master was actually none other than Malcador the Sigillite, that tricky, lying, sneaking son of a gun. And this is why I believe that this is all basically myth-making, because this is exactly the kind of thing Malcador would establish, some kind of legend that people could rally around and that people could identify with to keep them in line and keep them enthusiastic. It's just his MO, this secrecy, and he just enjoys kind of weaving these narratives and having a flair for the dramatic. So, him being the secret leader of all these assassin leaders does make sense. That's how they all could have been doing what they were doing, thinking they were just acting on their own initiative, even though all 6 of them were being directed by someone with that network of intelligence, who could get them the information that they needed without them really knowing where exactly it was coming from. But then, what about that bit about the Imperial Assassins first being the purview of a group of custodes? Well, what I believe is that unless that's been retconned, they were initially answerable to those custodes, but Malcador, either convincing the Emperor or the custodes themselves, got to take charge of the assassin program, and therefore molded it into the Officio Assassinorum. He probably gave the logic of, oh, the custodians just have a lot better things to do than manage a bunch of mortal humans who are all fallible. Let me handle it, I can take care of that. And honestly, that kinda does seem like something the Custodes would agree to on some level, and that the Emperor would at least understand. And part of the reason why Malcador would likely do that is because he didn't fully trust the Custodian Guard. Now make no mistake, he knew they were loyal down to the molecular level, and that nobody else was better suited to protect the Emperor and enact his will. But he also didn't want them holding all the cards. He knew they were impassive. He knew they would sacrifice anything and destroy anything and anyone if it meant securing the Emperor's safety even just a tiny bit more. And that can lead to oversight, because sometimes to complete the Emperor's vision, there have to be risks. You have to let gaps open up. But the Custodes just can't really do that. This is actually Malcador's reasoning behind making sure that the Terminus Decree, that being a phage which would wipe out all transhumans in the galaxy that was created right at the very end of the Siege of Terra, but never used, would be in the hands of his chosen rather than the Adeptus Custodes, who were initially the ones in charge of Basilio Foe, the mad scientist criminal who made the virus. Well, at least that used to be the Terminus Decree until very recently, something I and many others have made some very exasperated videos about. And I cannot tell you how happy I am about that. Jokes aside though, he did this not because he didn't trust the Custodes or because he thought they would use it for evil, but because he didn't want the custodians holding all the cards when the dust settled and if it didn't have to be used. Because he knew it would linger even after the heresy was done. So it would make sense that he maybe felt that way earlier on, back when the Custodes were the ones controlling the assassins. He wouldn't want them to have that extra power as well too, especially after what happened to the Thunder Warriors. Again, not to say he didn't trust them, but it's possible he thought, mayhaps they did that a little too well. So he would then create, with a level of inter-department separation, the 6 temples of the Officio Assassinorum, and they were given a secret headquarters inside the Inner Palace on Terra. And when I say secret, I mean secret. This chamber, known only as the Shrouds, actually does not appear on any maps of the Imperial Palace anywhere, meaning only the people who know about it are the ones who can find it. You have to be in the know. Like, the pathways to find the Shroud are hidden behind waterfalls and paintings and concealed with things like secret books in innocuous bookcases, things like that. Real cloak and dagger stuff that you would never find otherwise. and what's inside it is a giant octagonal table with a hololithic projector, where the 6 Directors Primus and the Grand Master can all meet with each other, and, of course, their identities are hidden. However, it should be noted that the Grand Master of Assassins is a High Lord of Terra, and as such, his identity is at least somewhat public knowledge. But despite that, the insides of the Shroud are a complete informational dead zone, with the walls themselves being proofed against any kind of detection device, even ones that scan for background radiation. And that's because, given the nature of what they do, there's no such thing as overkill, and all of this is very necessary. However, you might be wondering, how do you join these ranks? How do you become one of the most lethal human beings in the entire galaxy? Well, it all starts like most great paths in the Imperium of Man: being orphaned. You see, most people selected for the Officio Assassinorum are those orphaned at a young age, but particularly those from planets like Hive worlds, especially the Underhive, Death worlds, and Feral worlds, because those are going to be the people who are obviously the most dangerous, and if you can survive as an orphan in those places, you're clearly built a little different. From there, they will be transported to the Schola Progenium. That's basically where the Imperium dumps all their orphans in order to specially train them without parental consent. But while most people in the Schola Progenium are going to go on to become Tempestus Scions, or Commissars, or Sisters of Battle, or Imperial Guard commissioned officers, or even Inquisitors in some cases, the most lethal and dangerous among them will actually be plucked out of the program and just vanish off the record forever. That's where they'll be taken for their special training to become members of the Assassinorum. And that training actually begins before they even reach Terra, which is where the Assassinorum is headquartered. You see, on the ships to Terra, they will be exposed to the harshest conditions you can imagine. Things like low oxygen levels, low food, zero gravity, high gravity, blinding lights, or even complete darkness. And they will be constantly pit against each other for what little resources there are, or just told to go kill. So that by the time they reach Terra, only 1/10 of the original number will still be alive. And even then, that's not a guarantee, because the instructors might just think, you know what, these 10 only made it this far because this was a lightweight batch, all of these guys kinda suck, and just airlock everybody. But once they have made it to Terra and are secreted to the planet under the heaviest shrouding protocols imaginable, they will be put through essentially hell on earth in their training over the next several years, where their bodies are subjected to complete brutalization, with all the horrifying training equipment and vicious challenges put against them, and as they are continually made to get used to all the various stims and other substances they have to take in order to actually do their jobs. Because that's the thing about Assassinorum agents, they're not transhuman. They're still just normal biological humans. So for them to do the things they do and meet the feats they meet, they need to take hardcore substances, that being the Callidus polymorphine, or stims that help them stay awake for long periods of time, or rage-inducing drugs like, say, Slot or Psycho that cause them to go berserk if you're an Eversor. And eventually, given their skills and what the instructors know about them, that being the Lord Assassins, they will be sorted into the different temples. There they will train for a solar decade, before finally being inducted as full initiates into the Officio Assassinorum, each one part of a temple. And while the headquarters of the Officio Assassinorum itself, that being the Shroud, is located within the Imperial Palace, the actual temples themselves, barring the Culexus Temple, are scattered across Terra, and their locations are a closely guarded secret. However, we do know that the Eversor Temple, at least their main one, is located in the North Pole. And beyond that, they do have sub-temples in every sector and subsector of the galaxy, because it makes it easier for a rapid response. Many of you will probably note, this is a setup not too dissimilar from the Inquisition. And similar to the Inquisition, they also have another more overt, well, quote-unquote overt by assassin standards, headquarters called the Temple of Assassins, also located on Terra. And this is meant to be different from the Shrouds because this is actually the residence of the Grand Master of Assassins, and is home to a large store of very dangerous and destructive forbidden weapons, many of which are actually of Xenos origin. So while the Shrouds is more of a spiritual meeting place for the heads of the temples, and where the real dark decision-making gets made, the Temple of Assassins is also very important, and that's where all the activities of the Officio are overseen, because to manage and do all that they do, they have their own bureaucratic apparatus that is very large and extensive, such as the Office of Missions and the Office of Operations, all of which are, in true Imperium of Man fashion, separate entities with a degree of independence and rivalry between them in order to stop any one group of people or any person from ever gaining too much power. So, as you can expect, the vast majority of people who work for the Officio Assassinorum are actually not assassins, and are instead armies of clerks and bureaucrats who oversee everything from the well-being and accommodation of all the agents, to procurement and maintenance of new gear and chemicals, and even sifting through potential targets. But it's not all just pencil pushers and bean counters, because the Officio Assassinorum also has to manage all their operatives and auxiliary staff. These are people like spies, informants, intelligence operatives, and even weapons pushers that get them what they need and help them in their operations across the galaxy. Because, again, no one really functions alone in the Imperium of Man. Plus, they also have their own stealth ships that they need to get places, and with that they have their own astropaths and navigators. And all of these people, from ship staff to astropaths to navigators to clerks to intelligence operatives, everyone, are all forbidden from having any contact with the outside world. Their work within the organization is the be-all end-all of their lives, so it's actually a pretty shitty job to have. And in a way, it actually reminds me a lot of working for the Grey Knights on Titan, because when you think about it, it is a pretty similar setup, that being an isolated and miserable one. But it's the little things like this that really make me find the Officio Assassinorum, much like the Inquisition, endlessly compelling and fascinating. And one thing I want to say right off the bat, the Officio Assassinorum is part of the inspiration for one of my favorite factions in my own setting, a fantasy setting I made myself and want to make into a tabletop game that can vary between early modern to medieval. This faction is called the House of 1,000 Judges. You see, the main conflict that's going to be used to introduce people to the setting is the Rabeni War for Independence, that being the war waged by the peoples of the lands that make up Raben to push out the influence of the Arborine Empire, which wasn't formal territorial control but more so a sphere of influence. Think of like how the USSR controlled Eastern Europe. And, fittingly, the Arborine Empire to the north, which is comprised mainly of people of mixed wood elf and human ancestry called Arborines, is based off Tsarist Russia. Meanwhile, Raben comprises two main ethnic groups, that being the Rebei, which are these humans that are more based off Polish culture, and the Nokrines, that being people of mixed dark elf and human ancestry with purplish skin. The union of the two into one singular entity, that being the Kingdom of Raben, is meant to be kind of like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with the Rebei being the Poles and the Nokrines being the Lithuanians. And this is like a 25-year-long meat grinder of a conflict with no small amount of complexity and nuance to it, both politically and militarily. However, just to the west of what's going on in the war, still in the lands of the Arborine Empire and Raben, is a magical forest that is somewhat connected yet also somewhat separate from the rest of the continent. And as you can imagine, it's a fair bit bigger inside than it is outside. And generally speaking, it's seen as a place that's somewhat dangerous and not really considered to be of high value, so it's generally ignored. But inside it are peoples who are actually based more so off the medieval Anglo-Saxons and some of the Brittonic Celtic groups, like the Welsh and the Cornish. Those Anglo-Saxon-based people are called the Veldmen, and they're human. However, those Cornish Celtic people are called the Voltkin, and they're more like the magical mythical people of the forest, such as satyrs and other creatures. The Veldmen have their own petty kingdoms, with the largest among them being the one that's nominally in charge, but not officially. And the Voltkin have their clan systems, and they're known to fight quite a bit amongst each other, having a deep rivalry and enmity. However, there is a force above them, that being the Fae. There are 4 main groups of Fae, one for each season, and they make up the Seelie Council, the most important of them being the Autumn Fae, called the Hollowbriar Court. They enact control over the people, the Veldmen and the Voltkin, through things like debt collection, bad deals, and other such schemes, and they can be very devastating, because if you can't pay back your debts, you might just find yourself forced into slavery or transformed into a magical dog. And the Hollowbriar Court is led by the King of the Fae, that being Alberon Blackbriar. The other particularly important group are called the Everhunt, and these are the Winter Fae, and they are based a lot on the mythology of the Wild Hunt. Eventually though, the Veldmen and the Voltkin put aside their differences and form something called the Barrowhorn Covenant, so that they can try and fight against the Hollowbriar Court. However, they know they can't win this war alone, so they cut a deal with another group, that being the House of 1,000 Judges, who also operate in and around the Dark Forest. You see, the House of 1,000 Judges, or just the House for short, is a very, very secretive, highly militant religious organization comprising about 1,000 full members at any one time. You see, in ShadeSong, there are pieces of a book called the Book of Thorn floating around, and nobody knows their origin, or who wrote the book, or how old it is. So some groups, the main ones being a group in the east called the Conclave, and in the west the House of 1,000 Judges, are trying to reassemble the book. However, while the Conclave is more open about what's in it, and believes in things like good works and such, the House is very closed off, and their only concern are purging those they deem to be wicked by the standards of the Book of Thorn as they know it, and collecting the pieces of the book above all else. Nothing else matters to them nearly as much as that, not even their own lives, because the House of 1,000 Judges is comprised entirely of people, much like the Officio Assassinorum, raised and indoctrinated from a young age as orphans. They begin their journey as owlings, or owlets, where they will shadow older members of the house, do what they say, and generally speaking be raised to be future Novari of the house, that being people who might become judges. And again, much like the Assassinorum, it is a difficult process that has a pretty high mortality rate, though maybe not as high as 1 in 10. From there, if they live long enough, they will become Novari, and these Novari will shadow full members of the house, and their work will become all the more rigorous and dangerous. From that point on, they'll have to wait for one of the judges to actually die, because again, there can't be more than 1,000. And when a position opens up, the next in line will undergo a process called ordination. And this process is conducted by none other than the head of the house, that being Mordecai, the mysterious leader of the organization, who again is unknown in terms of his age and where he comes from. So, he is a very dark and mysterious figure, and in many ways a very ominous one. The process of ordination involves him vivisecting the candidate, so you might not survive, and doing something to them, so that when they are closed back up, they have increased physical abilities and durability, and no longer seem to age at the same rate as normal humans. It's unknown how long a judge lives, but they live far longer than the average human. So, it is believed that after the process of ordination, a fully ordained judge is no longer human, and it should be noted that a full judge is one of the scariest things you could ever encounter on the battlefield. Plus, the magic they use involves the usage of blood. Specifically, they will use blue rune metals, I'll get more into that later when I get into the full details about the setting, which allows them to do things called scrying. So, they can sort of read impressions of the future, and they do this by using blood. It's a kind of magic called hemalurgy, and it is again something that makes people very uncomfortable, because both it and the process by which judges are rumored to be created seems to imply that they're almost necromantic in nature, something that is extremely illegal under pain of death basically everywhere in the world. So as you can imagine, the house makes people deeply spiritually uncomfortable at best and absolutely terrified at worst, with many of the Veldmen and Voltkin viewing them just as fearfully as they do the Hollowbriar Court. And Alberon Blackbriar would never admit it, but Mordecai absolutely terrifies him. But even with that in mind, the Barrowhorn Covenant does ally with the House of 1,000 Judges to try and topple the court, with the Barrowhorns meeting the court in the Battle of the Burning Field, and the judges directly assaulting the court's stronghold, Ka-Het-Braheder. But it does not go as planned, because it turns out Alberon, recklessly, insanely, had snuck in a ton of gunpowder from the outside world. And you can't even use a little bit of gunpowder in the forest without it backfiring spectacularly, hence why the technology never reached them. This created a gigantic monodirectional explosion that destroyed half of Ka-Het-Braheder and created in its place a giant wasteland, like a badland, where guns actually could be used. And it also killed a quarter of the house, 250 judges all dead. And most damningly of all, Mordecai was lost. The last anyone saw of him was him on the pathway outside of Kahet Breheder, heavily wounded, talking to the huntsman, that being the mysterious leader of the Ever Hunt, before he took off into the forest, hotly pursued by Alberon's charioteers and houndmasters. Since then, Mordecai has been presumed and stated dead by both much of the House of 1,000 Judges and the Hollowbriar Court, who declared victory. The reason this was so damning is because everyone in the house was answerable to Mordecai. There was no line of succession in place, and most dangerously of all, no one else knew how to make more judges. So, they can't make any more without him. You see, whenever anyone tries to, dissect a judge, what happens immediately when you open them up is their insides just instantly putrefy. This is generally believed to be a sort of magical failsafe put in by Mordecai so that enemies could not unravel the secrets of judge creation. So without him, they can't make any more fully ordained judges. And in the wake of such a crushing defeat, the house has split into three. There is the Old Order, who are committed to staying inside the forest and continuing their work, finding the pieces of the book and fighting off the court wherever they can, even in their diminished capacity. They're the ones facing the stiffest resistance, but they are technically the most numerous in number, though not by much in terms of judges. What they do have are more of the Owlings and the Benendants. You see, the Benendants are special individuals who, whenever they fall asleep, transform into giant, hulking owl monsters. These things are dangerous and incredibly powerful, and very difficult to control, having to be kept in line with whips and chains. But they are powerful, and the Old Order has the most of them. They believe they should continue on as normal, and that Mordecai is still alive. They also do retain control of the Knights' Chapel. You see, the planet this all takes place on, Erat, is actually surrounded by rings, and those rings will cast a 5-mile wide perpetual shadow on part of the planet that is always in darkness, and that is a very scary place to be. However, the chapel of the House of 1,000 Judges is located there, and even the chapel itself is made of entirely pitch-black materials. No light penetrates it, so being able to navigate it easily is part of the training. The second biggest faction are the Thousand Eyes. You see, some of them believe that yes, Mordecai is dead, and moreover, that he was apparently not infallible. They have actually left the forest and set out into the more populated areas out east, particularly in Rabin. There, they have established orphanages where they can start sifting through recruits and creating their own Novari. But these Novari are not raised from a very, very young age, and as such, could possibly be seen to dilute the blood of the house, something that is very concerning to the other factions. But they're operating more as an intelligence organization and as spies, doing things more covertly and engaging in assassination and information brokering, as well as, again, looking for pieces of the book. They do have a few Benendants, but what they have done is experiment on some of Mordecai's teachings, the ones they could at least decipher, and were able to create these things called false Benendants, which are not nearly as strong, but are easier to make, and are still very damn dangerous. The last group are called the Black Hand, and they actually set out into that desolated wasteland called the Blast, and it has effectively become the Wild West, a frontier land owned by no nation, where everyone is setting in to gather resources, explore, and exploit what they can. However, with war looming on the horizon between the various factions flooding into the Blast, the Black Hand would step in as effectively lawmakers and sheriffs to help keep everything on an even keel, especially since they are not tied to any one nation, all while they, obviously, continue to look for the book, and possibly try to find out the mystery of what might have happened to Mordecai, because they're not sure if he's alive or dead, but they believe this all could be part of some wider plan. And while the Old Order still wear the same clothes as the Old House, and the Thousand Eyes have adopted, say, domino and masquerade masks as well as formal clothing to better blend in with society, the Black Hand have effectively adapted to the harsh weather of the new place they find themselves in, wearing looser clothes and ditching hard masks in exchange for basically cloth with a bird skull painted on it. But most importantly, while the Old Order and the Thousand Eyes still eschew the use of firearms, using many of their old weapons such as crossbows, hidden blades, thrown weapons, and the like, the Black Hand have taken to using guns, such as pistols, derringers, and even shotguns. because they can actually use them safely inside the blast. But the other members of the house, the other two branches that is, find that to be very distasteful. So there is a lot of distrust and internecine conflict between these three successors of the house. But they are fully capable of putting aside their differences when the need arises, calling together a parliament in black in order to decide what should be done regarding any matters that threaten the house in its entirety, or threaten any one singular branch, because ultimately they are all siblings of the house. So even though they can't make more judges, and they lack the guiding influence of Mordecai, make no mistake, the old truth still holds sway. Those who fall afoul of the House of 1,000 Judges will not do so for long, one way or the other. With all of that out of the way though, let's go over the different temples of the Assassinorum, the first being the most famous one, the Callidus Temple. And I'm just going to dispel a quick myth here. A lot of people tend to believe that all Callidus agents are women. That's not necessarily true. Just most of them. And that's because they are shapeshifters. And the reason that matters is because the drug they use to shapeshift, polymorphine, is stated to work better with women than men. So it's not all women, just mostly. And out of all the different temples, the Callidus are the most reliant on their cunning and infiltration capabilities. Now, all assassins need to have some level of stealth and infiltration, it's just part of the job. But the Callidus take this to a whole nother level, because they have the least immediately destructive capability. They don't have the range of the Vindicare, or the abilities of the Culexus, or the sheer drug-fueled insanity of the All they have are their innate physical abilities, which again are very, very impressive, and their close-range weaponry. And they really don't have a lot to choose from. What the Callidus assassins have at their disposal are their phase sword, which is oddly enough made from Necron technology. You have to remember, these people get a lot of passes for a lot of things, and their neural shredder pistol. You see, their phase sword is able to shimmer actually in and out of reality, kind of like how, say, Necron deathmarks can basically go into a kind of pocket dimension as a way to sort of teleport, and this allows it to basically bypass any armor and even things like bone or any other kind of protection someone might have and go right for the vital organs themselves, meaning you could be killed by a phase sword and nothing would externally seem wrong with you. It's only after they opened you up that they would realize, oh wow, a heart is not supposed to be at the bottom of the chest cavity. And their neural shredder pistols are actually of a similar design ethos, because they don't just fire like a hard round, but instead fire a wave of frequency that happens to be the exact same frequency as most living beings' central nervous system, which will completely overload their brain and induce anything from seizures that could render someone unconscious to straight up death. And since it is a frequency, armor, buildings, vehicles are all completely bypassed and can do nothing to stop this wave. However, it doesn't work against any non-biological targets, such as Necrons or demons. And interestingly, one time a Callidus assassin went up against a corrupted heretical leader who actually turned out to be the Catan known as the Deceiver, and her both phase sword and neural shredder did nothing against it, and she ended up getting skinned alive. Plus, they always also have on them the good old poison blades, that being essentially like needles or hat pins that are more or less dipped in neurotoxin and can be easily concealed and deployed because, you know, you can't really beat a classic. And since all of these are, again, very, very close-range implements that are all geared towards killing biological targets instead of, say, going in guns blazing, it shouldn't really come as a surprise that their shape-shifting ability is the biggest thing about them that lets them get as far as they do when it comes to dispatching targets. And they actually have some options when they do kill a target, because unlike the other temples, they can make things look very covert. Say, introducing poisons through their needles that just look like someone had a heart attack, or again, killing someone very covertly with their phase blades, or using a neural shredder to just induce a stroke in order to ghost somebody without actually causing up a big fuss. This can be useful when dealing with, say, noble houses or other groups within the Imperium, where a high-ranking member might secretly be working with the Tau or under the influence of chaos, but killing them outright could cause a big fuss and alienate the rest of the family, leading to a much wider issue down the line. So, by ghosting someone immediately who is secretly problematic, you can avoid that entirely. That's what a Callidus assassin is good for. Or they can send a message. absolutely dismembering somebody violently, or making their brain explode, or introducing a very nasty, vomiting kind of toxin that's gonna make it very clear they were killed. And to that effect, some Callidus assassins will leave death cards, basically a sort of, Callidus assassin was here, don't ever try this again. And that's more so what they do when dealing with, say, heretical leaders or cult leaders, because they actually do that more than anything else, infiltrating burgeoning heretical cults, where you want to kill off the cult and its leadership, but it's not really worth it to, say, bring down the entire Manufactura on their heads or just bomb the planet with overwhelming force. All of this, and the fact that they are some of the few people consistently depicted as women, mean they show up more than anyone else in Warhammer stories, because they are the most interesting and bring the most unique traits to the table. There are some interesting instances where traitor marines have had Callidus assassins alongside them, such as Talos Valcorin, who apparently kidnapped one, and the loyalist Alpha Legionnaire, Occam the Untrue, active in the 41st millennium, who had a Callidus assassin with him who believed in his mission of weeding out the weak of the Imperium, and would regularly transform into an Imperial ecclesiarch that Occam had kidnapped, so that he could basically have his sort of Catholic confession moment. And similarly, Callidus assassins are, generally speaking, the ones who are most likely to appear in the retinues of Inquisitors, because they can be loaned out to the Inquisition at times. This is because, again, they have very unique skills that can't really be seen anywhere else. Vindicare are just snipers, Culexus are blanks and therefore hard to deal with, Eversors are Eversors, but a Callidus assassin can slot in with different groups very, very easily. And of course, no discussion about the Callidus assassins is complete without talking about the most famous one of them all, that being M'Shen, the Callidus assassin who killed Conrad Kurz. Granted, he basically allowed her to do so in order to prove a point about his rebellion and about how fate is unavoidable, and she didn't really live long after the fact, but still. Oh, and another thing I'd like to address when talking about the Callidus assassin is the bodysuit. You see, in the lore, that is something called sin skin, but the lore that they wear sin skin actually comes from 1987, and as such can be a bit dodgy on how it works. For example, it's stated in the lore that you need to remove your sin skin layer after 12 hours using a special solvent, or else you might just die, because it traps in the oxygen you have around you when you put it on, so that you can breathe in, say, underwater situations or even in hard vacuum, as well as dispersing your body's heat signature and providing other kinds of general protection. But Callidus assassins and other members of the Officio Assassinorum, who all allegedly wear sin skin, are going to be in those suits for a lot longer than 12 hours at a time, especially with Callidus and Vindicare assassins, where they're going to be in position for, at a time, days, weeks, months, and in some lore points, even years, before they actually get their target. So, they're not going to be having to take off the sin skin with solvent and then put it back on just to stay in cover. In essence, the sin skin, quote-unquote, of the Officio Assassinorum functions more like a very sophisticated body glove, that being a type of sort of jumpsuit that people can put on which hangs very close to their skin, and has more sort of functions and other things inside it that help the user be self-sufficient and keep going in combat situations. It helps regulate temperature, it provides protection, things like that. A lot of people have them. Sisters of Battle have body gloves, Space Marines have a form of body glove, and most Inquisitors wear them too under their clothes. It's just a very useful thing to have. Next on the list are the Vindicare assassins, and these guys, I will admit, I find a little boring, but there is a kind of beauty in the simplicity, because these guys are snipers. But they're not just your grandma's snipers, they're not your average ratling, they are the best snipers the Imperium has to offer, being able to sit and wait in a location for months or even years at a time, with one Vindicare even waiting in place for 6 years to kill a Drukhari Corsair. And they have been known to single-handedly win entire wars by stopping them from getting off the ground. Not just by assassinating one cult leader in his bedchamber, but by shooting them when they're in the middle of a speech in front of their followers, scaring the hell out of everybody and killing their will to fight. Furthermore, there was a famous instance when a Vindicare assassin, one lone one, took out an entire Eldari assault force by shooting their entire command staff. Warlocks, exarchs, support weapons crews, everybody over and over, until they just couldn't facilitate a sustained campaign anymore. They lost their entire logistics network. And when they tried to clear the tower that they realized he was in, they found it full of grenade booby traps, and the Vindicare completely gone. Also, Vindicare assassins are used most commonly than others to deal with threats that can't be shapeshifted into by Callidus assassins, such as orc war bosses who are about to start up a big wog, or perhaps those who might be infected by chaos and as such who you can't risk getting too close to, or leaders of chaos warbands. But it's not just traitor marines that they're adept at taking out, because there are many instances of Vindicare assassins being used by the Administratum and the High Lords to take out loyalist space marines who have defied the will of the High Lords. A notable example of this are the Celestial Lions, who, after having gotten to a row with the Inquisition over their treatment of civilians, had found themselves on the planet of Armageddon, where they would keep finding their brothers, particularly the ones in positions of command, taken out by suspiciously accurate orc sniper fire. However, the Inquisition shouldn't get too comfortable using Vindicare assassins to settle their grievances, because there are many instances of radical inquisitors being taken out by Vindicares. So these guys may seem a little bit boring, but boy are they dangerous. And you can really see why they're probably the most common kind of Assassinorum agent, because you really just can't beat a classic. They're so good at what they do. And the reason they're so good at it is because, well, obviously their amazing training, but also because of the gear they have. You see, what they have are, aside from just their normal Sin Skin suits, chameleonic chemicals inside the Sin Skin, which makes something called a stealth suit that allows them to not shapeshift, but sort of meld into the background of wherever they are, allowing them to remain concealed much better than normal. Plus, they also have their spy masks, which are those iconic mask plates that they have, which serve as a multi-purpose detection and optics tool. It allows them to pick out heat signatures, energy sources, and helps them make their shots even better. Plus, it also allows them to do so at insane ranges, doing things like calculating, say, the curvature of the Earth, and even monitoring enemy communication channels. It also comes equipped with food and water so that they can stay in place for, again, 6 years at a time. In order to do all of this and get all of this information, which is so much that it is said it would disorient even a veteran space marine to the Vindicare, they are actually plugged directly into them through neural interfaces, making it honestly less like a piece of war gear and more like the technology used by Knight and Titan pilots to interface with their war machines. However, all of that is just a chump change when compared to their most iconic tool of their trade, the Exitus rifle. And right off the bat, that's really funny because the word exitus in Latin means outcome or conclusion, usually in reference to death, and furthermore, the motto of the Vindicare Temple is Exitus acta probat, meaning the outcome justifies the deed. The Exitus rifle is hand master crafted so that it will never jam, never overheat, and never fail. Plus, their ammunition, which is made from heavy gravity special alloys, is able to literally one-shot space marines through the thickest parts of their armor. Hence why they're so commonly deployed against Chaos Space Marines and to take out chapters like the Celestial Lions. However, it's not just the rifle, because they also have the Exitus pistol, which is also incredibly powerful and mastercrafted to never ever fail the user. And the pistol, much like the rifle, is silenced but still has a lot of recoil. Recoil that can only be managed with the Vindicare's specially enhanced muscular structure. But what's really interesting is the special ammunition that they are issued. You see, there are 3 main types of ammunition that Vindicares are issued before they go on a mission. And these are, again, very heavy, special rounds that have their own mini cogitators inside them. And as you can imagine, each one is incredibly valuable, so they will only be given 3, one of each, per mission. And they are instructed to never let these bullets fall into the hands of anyone ever, even members of other assassin temples. It's actually the same deal with the Callidus assassins and their polymorphine. And in order to facilitate that, these rounds can actually be remotely self-destructed and will basically melt themselves so that they can't fall into the wrong hands. The first are the shield breaker rounds, and you're probably thinking, oh, those are just like armor-piercing rounds, right? Well, no. These bullets are actually psychically charged, so that they can overload energy shields, like conversion fields or other digital shields that some people might have, or even personal force fields. You see, the reason for that is because they are able to have anti-phase technology, which is actually very not well understood by even the Mechanicus of Mars, which, again, allows them to take on targets who might be protected by, say, a psychic field, like Eldar Warlocks in their rune armor, and Tyranid Zoanthropes. So it's great for picking off Eldar or people who might be otherwise demonically compromised. The next round are the Hellfire rounds, and these contain essentially bioacidic toxins that are delivered into the target through a cluster of thousands of tiny armor-piercing needles that will melt any organic matter they come into contact with. I find it weird that the Shield Breaker one sounds like it's going to be armor penetrating, but is actually a psychic round that gets rid of personal energy shields. And the Hellfire round sounds like it's going to be an incendiary round or something that explodes, but no, it's actually an acid bullet. I'm sorry, I just find these to be a bunch of misnomers here. But these rounds are really good for dealing with Tyranids. One shot from this can kill a Tyranid Lord and basically render an entire Tyranid assault force leaderless, with their hive mind presence greatly weakened. And lastly is the Turbo Penetrator round. This one is more like what it sounds. It's just a really strong armor-piercing round, which actually goes off in 2 stages. The first one is an adamantine jacket, but the second stage will punch a diamond-hard secondary round through any armor, and on one instance has been known to have been used by a Vindicare to dome 3 Chaos Space Marines in one hit. One thing that does kinda suck though is that according to the lore, these guys actually seem to have probably the highest rate of failure out of any of the assassin temples. One assassin, by the name of Aximos, failed to kill Azek Ahriman when his bullets couldn't penetrate Ahriman's psychic shielding, and another one, named Emeret Kultek, tried to kill a Genestealer Patriarch on the planet of Vigilus, something that was very important given how critical the world of Vigilus was. However, he whiffed his shot, with another Tyranid getting in the way, only leaving the Patriarch injured. And he almost got away until another Patriarch stopped him, and to his horror, this wasn't the same Patriarch. And it should be noted, it's kind of unheard of for a Tyranid cult to have 2 Patriarchs. So, he was taken off guard and torn to shreds. But the biggest failure of probably any Assassinorum agent ever has to be that of the Vindicare assassin, Aristide Kell. And this is one from all the way back during the Horus Heresy. You see, Aristide Kell would be sent along with several other agents of the Assassinorum to kill Horus Lupercal. This was one of the first instances of something called an execution force, when they gather one of each assassin from all or most of the temples in order to take out a particularly dangerous target. And considering the target was Horus, yeah, that is pretty warranted. But the entire force outside Kell would die, with Kell actually managing to infiltrate the vengeful spirit and remain hidden for years, waiting for the right moment to strike and kill Horus. But being alone on the vengeful spirit, a ship so touched and seeped in the powers of the warp made him start losing his mind, and he would eventually be discovered and brought to Horus. Horus would actually turn him to chaos. So this is probably the only instance of an Officio Assassinorum agent not just failing their mission, but turning on the Imperium. And Horus would then send him on a mission to kill Euphrates Keeler on Terra, something he would again fail to do, being cut down by none other than Nathaniel Garrow himself. And when Garrow asked him why he had done this and betrayed the Imperium, he said, Horus allowed him to see they were all traitors, betrayers, and betrayed. When you actually read the book this happens in, Garrow Vow of Faith, it's pretty clear that Aristide Kell had fully lost his mind. And I can't really fault it against him because, after all, he is a mortal human, having been exposed to the vengeful spirit and been brought to Horus Lupercal himself, but still, he is the only one, as far as I know, to ever turn on the Imperium so thoroughly. Next on the list is the Culexus Temple. And these guys are all blanks, meaning they are all humans born with the pariah gene, something that only exists in the human race naturally. Now, the pariah gene means those with it do not have a presence in the warp, so people's reactions to them can vary wildly, from general discomfort and unease if they're a lower level blank, to outright dying if they're a higher level blank. And this goes doubly or triply so for someone who's a psyker, because the presence of blanks nullifies all psychic and warp-related abilities. Demons will find it hard to actually stay in the material realm, and those who are highly psychically attuned will perceive the blank as just a menacing hole in reality. There was an entire lore piece of Eldrad Ulthran himself basically having a panic attack that humanity is reckless enough to utilize such creatures instead of just strangling them at birth. And the most famous blanks are, of course, the Anathema Psychana, the Sisters of Silence. However, the other most famous group are the Assassins of the Culexus Temple. And I'm again going to dispel a myth here. Much like how many believe all Callidus assassins are women, many people will also believe that all Culexus assassins are male, because, logically, if there was a female blank of that capacity, wouldn't they just ship her off to join the Sisters of Silence? Well, that's not really how it works. You have to understand, for the past 10,000 years, the Sisters of Silence as an organization have been left to languish and decay, getting very few recruits and very few resources outside of those who find Psykers to feed to the Golden Throne. So, they weren't really getting many new blanks. It's only recently, after the arrival of Guilliman, that their numbers are starting to be replenished meaningfully on Terra. So, most blanks would end up in the Culexus Temple. Interestingly though, this only really came to pass by the narrowest of margins, because when the blanks were first being harvested because the Emperor and Malcador thought they might be useful, a lot of members of the Terran elite, especially those in the Navigator houses, started kicking up a big stink about wanting every blank exterminated, because they saw it as a threat to their way of life. And the Emperor would pretend to comply, having the project publicly destroyed and all the specimens executed. However, the most promising examples would be spirited away by Malcador and form the beginnings of the Culexus Temple. And this is part of why the Culexus Temple is the only one not located directly on Terra itself, but instead on a small dead moon out in the further reaches of the galaxy. Because one, having that many blanks so close to the Astronomicon would be considered dangerous. That's also why the Sisters of Silence fortress is on Luna. And two, they are very, very secretive about their operations, especially when they actually wheel out the Culexus assassins, because there are a lot of people in the Imperium who would want to see the entire temple destroyed because they despise blanks. Even getting the Sisters of Silence back on track was an uphill battle for Guilliman. So, the Culexus Temple has to be very clever. And that's why they actually don't really have much autonomy. They are run almost entirely by the entire Temple of Assassins directly, because again, they are the most secretive of them all. Also, their main temple is called the Fortress of the Soulless. Like, I can't tell if that's rude or if it goes hard. What I find so interesting about the Culexus Assassins is that, barring some gear that augments and focuses and complements their abilities as blanks, they go into battle largely unarmed. They are entrusted only with their blank power. What they do have, though, are some special nodes in their sin skin that allow them to basically phase in and out of reality to make them appear like they're flickering. Kind of like, you know, horror movie characters will be not there and then suddenly be there when a light is flickering and then suddenly be gone, freaking out the main characters. That is the exact logic behind this reality phase shifting. Sure, it can be used to dodge some attacks and whatnot, but its real main purpose is just to sow as much fear as possible into the target. This nodule layer is called the Ethereum, and one other thing it can do is actually, get this, absorb the energy from incoming psychic attacks, ones that are not cancelled by the blank ability alone, making these guys completely impervious to all psychic attacks. However, that's not all, because they also have something called Psych Out Grenades, and you need to buckle up for this. You see, Psych Out Grenades basically contain pressurized canisters of psi-refractive particles. Now, sources can kind of vary on what happens to normal people caught in the blast of a Psych Out grenade. Some people say that you'll collapse effectively with all your thoughts knocked out of you, while other sources say it'll just do nothing at all. However, what everyone agrees on is what happens to Psykers when they come into contact with these things, because it is essentially the equivalent of psychic mustard gas, causing their psyche and powers to turn in on themselves and mentally rip them apart. But the really insane thing, and I mean really insane, is what the Psych Out grenades are made of. It's because those psi-refractive particles that comprise the bomb are only produced in one place in the galaxy: the Imperial Throne Room on Terra. These things are the byproduct of the Emperor functioning on the Golden Throne. They are literally throwing bombs full of the Emperor's dandruff at people and killing them with it. As you can imagine, these things are damn near priceless and only used by the Culexus assassins and some inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus. That is really bonkers to me. But it's not the thing the Culexus assassins are most visually known for. And that's because their most iconic piece of war gear is the Animus Speculum, that being the elongated skull helmets they wear. These are specially designed battle helmets that help them regulate their blank aura. You see, when they're not in combat, they have these helmets on and have the helmets set to dampen, so that they're not completely intolerable to be around. But when they're in battle, oh boy, because not only do they let loose and turn off the dampening, they also use the helmet to focus and amplify it. And you might be wondering about that giant head lens cannon thing. Well, that is actually something that gathers up psychic energy around the Culexus assassin, both ambiently around them and from enemy psychers, that being the ones whose attacks are absorbed by the Ethereum, and those who are just unlucky enough to be too close. Also, interestingly, some lore sources state that the Animus Speculum isn't directly operated by the Culexus assassin themselves, and is instead under the control of a custodian who must accompany them. Now, I'm pretty sure that's a really old and outdated piece of lore, possibly from the 2nd or 3rd editions, but allegedly, this is to make sure they don't get a little too eager and ahead of themselves and end up blowing their cover as to what they really are. Because remember, the fact that they are blanks is a guarded secret. In fact, it's this close guarding that means that there are very few Culexus assassins who are really known for any notable deeds. They're probably the one that has kept the most under wraps. However, what we do know is that most of their successful operations have been part of execution forces, that being, again, when they team up all the temples against the demonically inclined, including once a demon prince in the Eye of Terror, and against the Thousand Suns on several occasions, because rubric marines can't detect them at all. What is funny, though, is the fact that even though these guys are the most terrifying to be around, they're actually just really awkward in person, because given their upbringing as pariahs who are often kept on the fringes of society, and later their very isolated training, they all have really poor social skills and are just kind of weirdly standing in the corner. It's really interesting to me just how much of the Imperium of Man is held up by people with weaponized autism. Next on the list is the Eversor Assassin, and this is the one a lot of you are probably waiting for, because these are the really fun ones. Because, you see, the other assassins at least feel like assassins, you know? Special anti-psyker abilities, shape-shifting, sniper rifles, but the Eversor is just asking the question, hey, what if instead of anything stealthy, we just covered the Tasmanian Devil from Looney Tunes in knives and gave him meth? And what I just said there is not anything even close to an exaggeration. Because while the other assassins are generally speaking used to eliminate a target for a specific reason, the Eversor Assassin is meant more so as a declaration of intent. You see, Eversor Assassins are, by far, the most augmented out of all the assassin temples, because they have their bodies changed surgically and their minds psychically altered more than any other, so that they can utilize intense, ludicrous amounts of combat drugs in order to become nearly unstoppable. And in order to process all of these drugs and substances, they have extra adrenal glands, more synaptic connections in the brain, and even a second heart not unlike a space marine. And all of this is so that they can utilize that diabolical concoction of combat stims and chemicals without immediately exploding. And no, that's not hyperbole, I do mean explode. Because if an Eversor's brain or hearts stops working, then that highly volatile stew of chemicals in their system will have nothing to process it. So without any immune system to actually filter out the toxins, they'll start mixing inside the Eversor rapidly once it dies and explode in a chemical blast. Something that Eversors are known to try to do intentionally as a last-ditch effort. But, ironically, even though their body is biologically engineered to process the toxins, without them, the Eversor will die, because they are that addictive. So, the only way for Eversor assassins to function properly and not just die immediately is to spend their entire lives in cryostasis, where they're kept waiting for the next mission, unaware of how much time has passed. Then, when it's deemed necessary for an Eversor to be rolled out, they will be moved to a drop pod, and that specialized drop pod will upload the details of the mission directly into their sleeping brain, so that by the time they hit the surface of a very unfortunate planet, they are now fully roused from stasis and have all the mission details. Now you're probably thinking, that seems like the most miserable existence imaginable, like their entire life is just killing and missions and nothing else. And they're also on super meth, which will kill them if they don't have it. But they actually don't mind, because they are bombarded with so much propaganda and psycho-indoctrination that their frothing loyalty to the Imperium would put the most zealous Sister of Battle to shame. So as you can imagine, one of these guys is never gonna pull an Aristide Kell and betray the Imperium. However, that doesn't mean things can't go wrong. You see, sometimes they will go overboard and start to mentally destabilize. Shocking, I know, at which time they'll be essentially retired. And I don't mean retired as a euphemism for euthanized, I genuinely do mean put on ice, because they will be put in something called permastasis, where they just don't wheel them out for missions anymore. But you might be wondering, why not just kill them at that point? Well, it's because, in extremis, they will wheel out permastasis Eversors and send them at the most dire situations. And I know you're probably wondering, what in God's name could warrant not just an Eversor, but a super unstable Eversor, who literally the Inquisition was afraid to use? Like, what brings that on? Well, an example can be found when a permastasis Eversor was deployed alongside two Space Wolves Great Companies to help retake a former chapter world that had only just recently exited a warp storm and was now under the control of the Wordbearers. You see, that's the thing about Eversor assassins. Where the other assassins are used, generally speaking, to get one or even a handful of targets, Eversors are more of an area of effect assassination kind of deal. Like, you don't send an Eversor after a corrupt planetary governor. You send them after the entire planet's aristocracy, to decapitate the entire system. The Ordo Hereticus will do it if they know that there's some kind of dissent or possibly even secessionist ideas brewing among a planet's elite. If they happen to be infected by chaos and it has spread amongst them, then the Ordo Malleus will send them in. Or if they happen to be gene stealers, then you can expect the Ordo Xenos to send the Eversor. But the result will always be the same. Absolute, unsubtle carnage. And that's the point. You see, you're not supposed to be subtle when you bring an Eversor. They're just not capable of that. So, why not go in as loud as possible? It is to make a very clear statement to anyone on the planet who would ever dare breathe dissent, and even on surrounding planets when they inevitably hear about the entire ballrooms full of blood and guts. Remember, the Eversor is not just your death, it's written in their motto, which says, "Fear me, for I am your apocalypse." Goes insanely hard. A really good example of this exact thing happened on the world of Dumroman 6, where the leading clan, called the Mackenzies, were wiped out by one Eversor assassin because it was discovered that they had been sponsoring pirate raids against neighboring mining worlds, as well as a few other general heresies. So, one single Eversor assassin would kill all 317 members of the clan, the youngest of which was only 3 weeks old. And there was so much killing during all of this that the Eversor would have to resort to using butter knives and metal spoons to get the job done. But get the job done he did, and let's just say the ruling clans of that planet have not tried anything like this since. However, it's not all chuckles and sunshine, because in one instance, an Eversor assassin was sent to kill a Tau commander, but when that proved impossible because the Tau commander was already gone, he detonated himself and ended up killing a Tau ethereal. But this would ultimately be for naught, because that commander, Commander Longknife, would end up defeating the Imperium and driving them off the world of Taros. That's the thing about these guys, they're very terrifying and very good at what they do, but they're just really unwieldy. Still though, woe be to anyone who says they are not good at what they do. And to that effect, let's look at some of the tools of their trade. Now, we obviously know they have all their chemicals and stims, but in terms of weapons, they have a few things at their disposal, the first being the Executioner pistol. And this one is interesting because it's essentially two different guns taped together. You see, the bulk of the Executioner pistol is a bolt pistol, Good, reliable, destructive, you know what it does. But underslung on the barrel is another gun, a needler. You see, needlers are pistols used by unaugmented humans that fire a small concentrated laser and a small crystallized shard of neurotoxin. The laser melts a hole through a target, either in its body or through its armor, and then the neurotoxin penetrates and does its job. Also, it should be noted that given their nature, needlers are almost entirely silent. However, when you're dealing with an Eversor, silence isn't really something on the menu. However, neurotoxins are absolutely a big thing for the Eversor assassins, because their other most iconic armament is the Neurogauntlet. And for anyone familiar with the design of the Scarecrow in the Arkham games, this one should look familiar, because it is a gauntlet where each finger ends in a blade that can inject viciously deadly and painful neurotoxins. And just for good measure, they do have some more conventional weapons, such as a hyperdense power sword and a couple melta-bombs to help deal with things like vehicles. It's all of these things and factors and traits that make me believe that the Eversor assassin out of all of them is the one most capable of dealing with space marines. Well, at least in a fair fight. You see, I think Vindicare assassins are the ones that have killed the most space marines because of, their sniping. But that requires you get the drop on them, and it needs a lot of prep time, so it's not really a fair 1v1 fight. Callidus assassins too can kill space marines, but by disguising themselves as, say, a chapter serf and infiltrating them. And Callidus assassins are also very effective, but space marines are not so easily rattled. And if the space marine in question isn't a librarian, then they might be able to fight off a Callidus. However, an Eversor assassin is more than a match for your average space marine. In fact, when one captain of the Flesh Tearers chapter was fed up with Gabriel Seth, who he believed was wasting the lives of his brothers, he would contact the Inquisition and got them to get in touch with the Assassinorum to send over an Eversor assassin rather than just do it himself. And while Gabriel Seth would win the fight with the Eversor, it should be noted it wasn't an easy battle, and he is a named and famous Space Marine chapter master, so it shouldn't be considered that much of a surprise that he was able to survive. They're not going to kill off Gabriel Seth. But still, the fact that they believed an Eversor could kill him of all people really says volumes about what they could do to your average battle brother. Now, all of that covers the 4 main temples. However, there are 2 minor ones, Vanus and Venenum. Vanus assassins are essentially the cyberpunk ones, and they have, in my mind, the coolest aesthetic by far. You see, the Vanus Temple are the information brokers of the Assassinorum, and they're the only temple that engages in non-lethal operations. Their agents are called infocytes, and what they do is gather up as much information as humanly possible to the point where it borders on compulsion, and apply that towards the creation of disruption operations and incredibly detailed, highly accurate predictive analysis. They're effectively like living logic engines, but less servitor and more like Mentat from Dune. So you might be wondering, how are these guys even assassins? How do they kill people without ever having their agents set foot on the ground? Well, that's done through, again, the usage of information to get other people to do their killing for them. Let's say there's a noble family who is particularly corrupt, and the Assassinorum wants to deal with them. Rather than send in an Eversor to kill them all, wouldn't it be better if, say, the information about all their dirty dealings, both real and fabricated, ends up, I don't know, leaking to the head of the local garrison, causing a military coup? Or perhaps an entire city has been breathing rumblings of rebellion or discontent against the Imperium. Well, perhaps that city is suddenly going to catch the plague, and the vaccine shipments might be delayed indefinitely. Or maybe you just need one person from a noble family gotten rid of, and the Vanus Temple finds out that they've been having some kind of an affair, with pictures available. And maybe their lover, who finds these pictures, also happens to find, oh wow, a pistol under their bed. And on it goes. It's very diabolical and just really interesting in concept. However, you'd think this would put them at a disadvantage when it comes to the other temples, because they just don't have the same shock factor. They don't have the same weight to throw around. And listen, if things really get ugly, I'd rather be with one of the other temples than the nerds. However, the Vanus Temple has a solution for that as well, because they spy on not just every other single branch of the Imperium, and make sure to store monumental amounts of blackmail information on everybody. So, as you can imagine, their equipment, generally speaking, doesn't really have anything to do with weaponry. Now, on occasion, they will send an agent out to do some fieldwork and kill somebody. Those are called unbound infocytes, but that's a pretty rare thing. So, most of their gear is all dealing with information. They have those special helmets that feed information to their brain, data spikes that let them plug into computers, and equipment that helps them link up to the noosphere telepathically. Plus, they also have these cool data cogitator gauntlets that project hololithic panels around them in the air and feed them information that they can sift through and sort through with their fingers. Kind of an Iron Man's workshop sort of situation. But what's really cool to me are their menageries of animal automata. They have cyber eagles that can fly over places to gather information, rat automata with cameras in their eyes, and what they're most famous for, netfly swarms. You see, these are little organic metal automaton flies that will chew into any fiber optic cables they find and transmit the data back to the Vanus handlers, who are usually in a ship above the planet, if not somewhere very hidden on the surface. This is how they get their endless amounts of blackmail content and otherwise compromising information. I love these guys because they're just so much more different than what you would think of as your typical assassin, yet they get the job done just the same. I think it's really cool. However, it really shouldn't come as a shock as to why these guys are one of the two minor temples. And the other minor temple is Venenum, and as the name suggests, they're the ones who deal with poisoning people. So shouldn't it actually be like Poisonum or something? Because venom and poison are two different things. And I'd say these guys are probably the most boring and the one we know the least about outside of the currently active temples. And that's because, well, it's poison. What really is there to say? They just don't seem to do as much, and in terms of combat capability, they seem to have some of the lowest capability aside from Vanus. You see, they will poison people. Infiltration, stealth, pre-planning, and many other such things. But again, it's just not that intensive, and I feel like it's nothing a Callidus assassin couldn't do as well. Their big advantage though is stealth, because some of the poisons they will use on their targets are completely undetectable in autopsy, meaning you can entirely ghost somebody in the same way you can't even do with a Callidus assassin. And they do have some weapons. For example, their first and foremost weapon are toxin injectors, that being needles not too dissimilar from the Eversor ones, but maybe not as bad, that they use to inject toxins into people that will kill them. And they also have poison globes, that being fragile crystalline gas bombs that are again not dissimilar from ones used by other groups, in particular the Alpha Legion, who use things called venom spheres. And they also have melee weapons called hook fang blades, which are, as you can imagine, poison-tipped daggers, and apparently the venom on them is so lethal that one scratch will blah blah blah. You get the idea. It's just, again, not that very interesting. And it is stated that the Venenum Temple saw the most success during the horusheresy out of all the temples. But again, I think it's a pretty easy job to have. You're just poisoning people. Okay, though, I am being a little hard on them, because they do have some interesting stuff under their belt. One time, a Venenum assassin was supposed to kill an anti-imperial corrupt governor on a planet, but their ship got caught in the warp for like almost 700 years. So by the time they exited warp space, the governor was obviously gone. However, the governorship had been replaced by a democratic council, which was also very heavily anti-imperial. So our intrepid Venenum assassin said, "Listen, timing be damned, I was sent here to kill enemies of the Imperium, and that's what I'm gonna do." So they spent 3 days poisoning every single chair in the council chamber. And that must have been a very interesting phone call to make back to the temple. Still though, there's really just not much in terms of their records, and I would imagine that means they are the least utilized. And I do have a theory as to why that might be, and it's twofold. You see, assassins are only really deployed on the orders of the High Lords, and the High Lords being aristocrats would probably be made very uncomfortable by the Venenum assassins. The reason for that is because what they do probably feels the most intimidating and real, quote unquote. Because generally speaking, the odds that someone you're with is actually an assassin in disguise, or that you're gonna get shot by a sniper, or that a soulless individual is gonna delete your brain, or that you're gonna get torn to shreds by a methed up ball of knives is pretty low, but never zero. However, the idea of being poisoned is probably something that's eminently present in the back of every High Lord's mind. So, I think Venenums would just make them inherently very uncomfortable. And there's also the fact that before he became the Grand Master, Draken Vangorich was a Venenum assassin. And speaking of Vangorich, I bet you probably all want me to go into the beheading and the Wars of Vindication, and even before that, the plot to kill Horus. However, I don't think I have time. This video has pretty thoroughly gotten away from me in terms of length, and I've just kept rambling on. So if I start going on about everything that's happened in the past, and some of the new stuff that the Assassinorum has going on, the length of this video would start getting a little yucky, so I think I can save that for another video about how the Assassinorum is just useless or something. However, I would like to get into the other two temples, which are now quite possibly defunct. And first up is the Adamus Temple. And these guys are basically just ninjas. You see, the Adamus Temple is said to be the oldest of all the clades/temples in existence, and it's not known whether or not it's still active in the 41st millennium. And that's because their shtick is just very, very simple. They're said to specialize in what are known as decapitation strikes, that being taking out enemy leadership, but basically all assassins do that. What they do have, though, are two pieces of interesting gear: the Nemesis Blade and the Needle Spine Blaster. The Nemesis Blade is essentially just a katana. It's said to be based off an ancient blade from forbidden blade masters and their traditions in the Pan-Pacific region of Terra. So yeah, a katana. What's really interesting though is that despite the fact that Nemesis blades are unaugmented, they're not force weapons or chainsaw weapons or anything, they are able to cut through most armor because they're just that sharp. However, something tells me that most is in reference to like mortal human armor and doesn't really apply to, you know, space marines. So when you take that into consideration, it shouldn't be too surprising that these guys were retired. Why have an Adamus Temple assassin when you could just put them into one of the more specialized clades? They're not totally useless though, they have more than just the sword. Specifically, the Needle Spine Blaster. And remember when I said the Eversor's pistol was basically a bolt gun with a needler taped to it? This is the opposite, because it is a needler with an underslung bolt pistol. Again, effectively the same thing, just in reverse. What we do know about these guys though is that they were active during the horusheresy, because their new miniature is usable in the horusheresy game. However, they don't have one for normal 40k. Also, the reason these guys exist in the lore to begin with is because back in 1989, there just were Imperial assassins, but they have now since been benched and reworked. So their model is the old Imperial Assassin model, or at least it's based off it. So that actually gives me a lore theory as to where these guys might have come from and might have gone. You see, when it initially states in the lore that the first assassins of the Imperium were the ones active during the Unification Wars on Terra and were answerable to the Custodes, I believe that's who these guys were. And then, when the Horus Heresy came about, they proved themselves to be very ineffective, because again, I don't think those Nemesis blades are going to be cutting through any ceramite. And as such, the temple was probably just phased out. However, the temple we know doesn't exist anymore is the Maerorus Temple. And unlike all the other branches of the Assassinorum, which date back from the Great Crusade all the way to the Unification Wars, the Maerorus Temple came into existence around M40. So you might be asking, why? What prompted the creation of another temple almost 10,000 years after the fact? Well, it's apparently because the assassins realized that, oh, all of them have a specific niche when it comes to killing, but they didn't have a temple specifically designed to kill multiple targets at once, such as allegedly the command structure of an enemy army or a particularly large chaos cult. Now, that makes things odd right off the bat, because yeah, they have absolutely done that before. One Vindicare assassin blunted an entire Eldari army by picking off their leadership. One Eversor assassin killed over 300 people, thereby entirely eliminating a disloyal clan. And one Venenum assassin killed over 1,000 people with just their chairs. Like, I assure you, if you're creative enough, which assassins very much are, yes, you can absolutely take out multiple groups of people. But their reasoning was, oh, it keeps getting harder to kill successive targets. Again, Eversors seem to be able to do that pretty damn effectively. However, I think the reasoning here might have been, oh, we don't want someone who needs all that kind of prep time, like has to wait in position for so long and get all this information and this and that. We want something we can just throw at a group of people and know it will kill them all. Well, here's the thing. That's what Space Marines and Tempestus Scions are for. What they're describing is a spear-tip assault, and that is something multiple groups to pull off. Oh no, we have trouble dealing with multiple targets at once, because that's not your job. That's not what an assassination is. you're discussing a military action. You are very clearly not the military. And furthermore, whatever you're describing, I'm almost certain can be accomplished by an execution force, or even like 3 or 4 Eversors. And if that feels like it's out of the scope of what you're comfortable with, maybe this one shouldn't be your problem. This is something I want firmly on the table. All that happens after this is because the Officio Assassinorum refused to stay in their lane. So, what they wanted was a specialized assassin type that could kill large groups of targets, but also didn't need weapons, because then they wouldn't be subjected to, say, the noise of weapons, or running out of ammunition, or weapon malfunctions. So it needed to be a biological living weapon in some way. And they knew this was beyond their scope to handle on their own. So the Vanus Temple stepped in and did what they do best. They tracked down members of the Adeptus Mechanicus who had more, say, radical ways of thinking, and then started blackmailing them, but also got them things needed to bribe them, such as an STC template and even waging entire wars on their behalf in secret, all under the noses of the High Lords of Terra, even the Fabricator General. And this process of getting blackmail information and schmoozing up to them took centuries. But it was done, and the Mechanicus would develop the extremely illegal technology needed to create the Maerorus project. See, what they did was create a giant prison camp where thousands of prisoners would be blended down into biomass soup, which would then be combined with mutagenic substances and tyrannid DNA. This would then be used to create the Maerorus assassin. Yes, assassin. The singular. Only one was ever made, and her name was Liegenstrasse, which, funnily enough, is a subway station in Hamburg, Germany. Now you might be wondering, okay, now you have your assassin, what's so special about her? Well, not only was she again capable of killing many targets at once, but also she had special membranes on her body that allowed her to absorb the biomass of those she killed, and then use their genetic material to start rapidly mutating her own body, therefore making herself an adaptive killing machine, which removed the problem the Assassinorum had of subsequent kills becoming harder. You could just keep adapting on the fly. So, Alex Mercer. They literally just made Alex Mercer from the Prototype games. Also, side note, because of this, I actually googled when Prototype 1 came out, and it was 2009, which was 16 years ago, and just reading that made my knees immediately start hurting. Okay, so the Officio Assassinorum had officially created life. Great. But as they say, life, finds a way. And that it did, because this thing went full Jurassic Park and started laying fertile eggs which hatched into more assassins. And we don't know how many of these eggs were laid and how many hatched, but one hatched clutch of them did kill an entire guardsman company. That's around 300 guardsmen. And I know that might not sound like a lot when talking about the Assassinorum, but you have to remember these things were literally just born yesterday. Tiny with no training. And yet, 300 guardsmen dead. And it was at that opportune moment that Liegenstrasse decided, hey, you know what? Who even needs the Imperium? I'm just gonna go ahead and topple the damn thing. And the sheer insanity that the Officio Assassinorum had to go through in order to fix this is mind-bending. But I will say that's probably out of the scope for this video. Just know that Liegenstrasse was destroyed, and the Maerorus Temple therefore ceased to exist. However, at some point I would love to get into the specifics of the Liegenstrasse incident, as well as the War of the Beast, and the Wars of Vindication, and even the stuff going on in the 41st millennium. But as previously stated, I don't really have the time for that now because this video has gotten way too long. So we're gonna go ahead and call this at the end of our episode about the agents of the Officio Assassinorum. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think the agents of the Assassinorum are as cool as I think they are? Do you think maybe they're a little overrated and just kind of a gimmick? Do you want to see more of them? Or do you think that their presence just kind of distracts from the more important things in the setting, like the large-scale battles? As always, I would love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, consider supporting me on Patreon, and joining my Discord server linked below, and until then, I will see you in the next video.